Welcome back to Fair's Writing Academy, and before any literary geniuses come in, I recognize that my academy is in no way a substitute for a proper education. I'm just giving basic things that most people should at least have a grasp of before they should be writing a story. You would imagine these to be painfully obvious things throughout a story, and therefore very good reasons to judge a story by them, but apparently the writers from Disney, who are paid more in a month than I ever will be for the entire year, have not actually mastered these things, which makes me wonder if they actually deserve the job they have, but I digress. The point is, these are 101. These are very simplified explanations of things that you should probably know when you're writing something, or at least keep in mind. And I am well aware that most rules in writing can be broken. In fact, you can break all of them. But unless you know why they are problems or why you should avoid them, it's hard to break them without doing something wrong. But this video is about expanded canon and why it's a bullshit defense when you're trying to talk about a series. This is for the "it was in the expanded universe" crowd. You see them all the time trying to explain away issues with a show as "it was in the expanded universe." Just because it's part of the EU doesn't make it good. This should be obvious. The fact that it existed elsewhere just means it was a bad thing that existed elsewhere before it was a thing in this. It's either a good idea for the story or it's a bad idea for the story. And in another video, I went into how something happening in one story could affect its story very poorly, whereas that same thing happening in another story could affect your media very little. And you have to be careful when you take all of these canons and put them together. Your expanded universe also runs the risk of creating canon that will affect the story moving forward, regardless of what it's in. You don't want the expanded universe to be all one story. That's why they altered it and split it off with the expanded universe in the Marvel movies. I still think Loki undermined the accomplishment of the Avengers a little bit, but I'd like to publicly take back my theory that it was going to make all their efforts seem worthless. They played it off really well, to be honest. In Loki, it's not that the TVA was forcing the right things to happen. They just murdered anyone who made a decision that created a different timeline. The time and space version of eugenics. Pruning any timeline that branches off before it gets too out of hand. And now, with the expanded universe being able to have all kinds of variations of every kind of world, if they do something and create a canon in one world, that does not necessarily carry over to the other worlds. It's a bit of a cheap way to get out of the canon being destroyed from one timeline over to the other, but I suppose technically it works. It's what I imagine the professionals in the writing industry would refer to as a cop-out. But an effective cop-out it is. And there are many reasons you wouldn't want to overexpand your universe, namely in the Star Wars universe. Look at what happened to Star Wars. A lot of people complained about the second of the new trilogy and how she hyperspaced through the enemy ship in order to destroy them, and they say, why didn't they do this in every space battle? This is so stupid. What a stupid thing to add into the canon. You cannot use expanded canon then, because in the PlayStation 2 Battlefront 2 game, there's a part of the story where they attempt to hyperspace through a fleet, and they mention that that would rip right through them. So hyperspace weaponry in both that video game as well as several different books already existed in canon. As for why they don't use it regularly, I guess people don't like winning fights for some reason. And there's a lot of things out there in the books that either blatantly contradict each other or blatantly contradict the central storyline. But Star Wars brushes all that aside by saying, well, there's multiple universes now. People got so upset when Disney declared them all to be legends or unrelated to the movie canon, and I'm sorry, but they had to do that. The books contradicted each other left and right. The books contradicted the central media left and right. There was no way you could have made this all one story. Not unless reality itself collapsed around the singularity of contradictions. Which, to be honest, at this point, probably would have been, the smarter way to go. And using it to explain away events happening in a central media is also a problem, because the media should probably be explaining this themselves. The Star Wars sequels decided to speedrun this by doing it inside of the 3 movies, not even relying on expanded canon. Why is Rey so good at fighting? Well, she had a stick and probably learned to defend herself on her homeworld. Not with a sword! Not with a lightsaber, which is very different than a standard sword. She had a staff! The fighting styles are not transferable. How did she beat Kylo Ren? Well, they had a Force connection and she, like, stole some of his powers and they explained it later. Stealing his level of power or gaining access to his knowledge, he still should have had the upper hand because he had more of it. And he very clearly showed that he could just force push somebody and win the fight immediately, so why didn't he start with that? How come she's learning all of these abilities so fast? Well, she's linked to Kylo Ren. She learned Force healing! Kylo Ren doesn't know Force healing. Well, they're like a dyad in the Force of, like, ultra superpower. That doesn't explain how she knew how to do something. And then they retconned in a fuck ton of changes in the third movie because they forgot to at all hint at the final point of their series. These are ridiculous defenses because you're retconning things in. You're making excuses for things that weren't actually shown or didn't make sense in the story. And trust me, there's a lot of other reasons why everything doesn't make sense there. But another very good reason why you can't just pull in explanations from other stories is because at some point it has to tell its own story. Something like the WandaVision series. It relied very heavily on you having seen other bits of the medium. You needed to know about various other parts of their world that were barely offhandedly mentioned in the movies. This may seem totally out there to all of you, but I do not have the vast majority of my life to spend reading comic books and consuming a million different cartoons and media. At a certain point, you have to accept that it is too much effort to get into all points of your story. There's a strong difference between referencing original material and relying on it. The Mandalorian referenced the original material, but you didn't need to know about it to enjoy the series. In fact, you didn't even need to know who the fuck the Jedi were to watch that series. A race of ancient sorcerers, just a mystique thing. Could move things with their minds, okay, we've got that set up. They use special weapons that cut through anything. Cool! Everything was established in the show that you needed to know about the Jedi. You didn't actually need to know who they were beyond that. It would certainly expand the experience for you if you did, but expanding the experience is something you do if you're a fan of it and want to learn more about it. So you go out, you seek other parts of the medium, and you become a fan. You consume more of it. You didn't need to know much else in order to get that series. The Mandalorians were an order of people. They were destroyed long ago, but these people are the last remnants. I don't know a huge amount about the Mandalorian Wars. I really don't. Mainly just read snippets about it. I don't even think I've got any of the books about them. They constantly referenced the rest of the material in that show, but you didn't need it to follow the story. No part of the story required it. Now, granted, the appearance of Boba Fett and the significance of it would probably be a lot more impactful if you knew who Boba Fett was. So I'd accept the argument that you do need to see at least the original trilogy to get the full experience. But something like Marvel, where you've got a million cartoons, a couple dozen movies, and uncountable comics, if you needed all the information from that in order to understand the story or movie, you'd never see another fan. Because they'd watch a movie, it wouldn't make any sense, and they'd leave. They wouldn't try and get into the fandom because there's too much of it. And it's where I keep getting the crowd that say, well, it was in the manga. This isn't the manga. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the anime. Well, it was in the comic books. This isn't about the comic books. We were watching a movie. But you cannot expect the average person to consider it good or for it to be considered a good movie if it is made exclusively for the fans and you need to have all of the previous information in order to understand it. Remember, whether or not your media was good was about whether or not it was actually good as it stood. It can be reliant on a few other different media, such as sequels or prequels or maybe the occasional offshoot. This is about how good you can make your media as it stands, not about how good you can make it if you have every single form of media and infinite time at your disposal. This will be a whole nother video on its own, but suffice to say, trying to explain away or justify things by endlessly expanding your story is a sign that you're bad at writing. Bottom line, just because it's part of the EU does not make it good, and that should be obvious. France is part of the EU, and we all know they're fucking terrible. Friendly reminder that the French words for cotton candy can also be translated as daddy's beard. Like, share, follow, comment, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you think you needed to know much about Star Wars to enjoy The Mandalorian? At what point is it too much of a for the fans media? I'm not saying you can't make these medias that are reliant, but you have to understand that it's not going to be considered all that good, and you're definitely going to heavily limit the amount of people who can enjoy it or will find it to be any good if you have to do research or have to already be part of the fandom to enjoy it. Tipping your hat to the fans is fine, but fan pandering is not exactly a healthy way to tell your story. But if you disagree or believe I'm misrepresenting any part of your series, let me know in the comments. I'd definitely be interested in learning if I've misrepresented something in some way. And much like most things with writing, these are very gray lines that it is very hard to find the exact boundaries of, but you should at least get an idea as to when you're getting too far to one side or the other. Though if you can't find a reasonable way to talk about canon and expanded universes in the comments, then at the very least, be entertainingly angry.